Welcome to Real Wealth, Real Health, the show that empowers you with insights, information, and inspiration to achieve your version of financial wellness. Learn how to balance living a full life today with planning for the future. This podcast is brought to you by Alpha Investing, a real estate-centric private capital network that provides exclusive investment opportunities to its members. And now, here are your hosts, Inde Dorico and Daniel Coca.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Real Wealth, Real Health. My guest today is Sylvia Kwan. Sylvia is the Chief Investment Officer at the woman first financial company, Ellevest. Sylvia is a CFA charterholder with a PhD in Engineering Economic Systems from Stanford and a BS in Computer Science and Applied Math from Brown. With more than 30 years of experience, she's held positions at Charles Schwab and Financial Engines. In our conversation, Sylvia talks about the results of Ellevest's Women's Financial Health Index and describes the shifts that she's seen in women's investing habits, goals, and priorities. Women are about to become the recipients of the greatest wealth transfer in history, and yet only 37% of women invest compared to 63% of men. In our conversation, Sylvia reflects on some of these key findings and discusses the trends that she's noticed amongst women when it comes to values-aligned investing, and explains how this shift will have major implications for the future of the financial services industries. A few key insights are Sylvia's incredible journey as a woman in finance, the benefits of illiquid investments, i.e. real estate, the Ellevest Women's Financial Health Index findings, how impact investing is changing the future, and what categories that you may not be looking at are worth looking at, changing demographic values, and why community is so vital for this movement. I really enjoyed this conversation with Sylvia and appreciated the time that she was able to give me, as Ellevest is a quickly growing financial company for women by women. And this is information-packed conversation and episode. So please enjoy as much as I did. Sylvia, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Inde. Great to be here.
Yes, I have been looking forward to this for such a long time. I've been getting to know Ellevest, and there's so much alignment with how I feel about financial advisory and financial advisory for women and how women think about wealth. And so such a treat to have you. I'm really looking forward to this.
Thank you. So am I.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I really wanted to start with was to ask you as Sylvia, what has your journey as an executive in finance meant for your personal growth? And where do you think you've grown the most? Because you have such an incredible background, and I just know that it's been a journey for you as a woman in finance.
It sure has been a journey, and one that in some ways was not intentional. I think I was naive when I started and I was just going along, not really thinking about it. But definitely as I've gotten older, I've gotten more intentional. And I think, financial services, as you well know, is a male-dominated industry, right? Where 86% of financial advisors are men and 95% of mutual fund managers are men, and so on and so forth. And so in a male-dominated industry, I think the good news is that if you're a woman, you will naturally stand out and people that you meet will remember you, right? But the bad news is that there's so few of us, and we often don't see ourselves reflected in the leadership of financial services companies. So personally, where I believe I have grown the most is actually kind of making myself visible, both at the company that wherever I am and also in public. And so what I mean by that is I'm really an introvert by nature. Like, I'm an analyst at heart. I love to do research. I love to do analytical work. And a lot of this is sort of independent work. I like to just spend hours poring over things. And so I'm not generally a person who enjoys the spotlight. And so I've really had to stretch out of my comfort zone and focus on being more outward facing. So that means, public speaking, presenting, really learning how to create compelling narratives that resonate with my audience.
Mhm.
And it's really a kind of a growth area for me, and actually realizing that, you can have great ideas and great thoughts, but they're not valuable if nobody hears them.
Mm.
And so I've learned a lot about the value of kind of creating a public space for what I'm doing and sharing that.
Wow. Wow. That is such a big thing, like the visibility piece. And I have heard that a lot of people can have great thoughts and ideas, but they need to be executed on. But the way you described it was probably more powerful because we have to speak up to even put it into action. Uh,
Yeah, that's
so
exactly right. That's exactly right. And then also, I've also really appreciated the value of great speakers and great communication skills, but because, you have a great idea, and if you can't communicate it clearly in a way that people can understand,
yes,
it's not as valuable as well. And
yes.
so just learning these by, the hard way,
Mhm.
and then also just appreciating the value of being in the space.
Yeah. And so with all of that you've been learning, because you are the CIO, so that's not usually the out front role, or is it? I mean,
True.
it's like, as an introvert and you're like all these things that you've been learning. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, like the CIO role, are you very out front?
I am, because I need to be.
Okay.
But you're right. In some sense, the chief investment officer, you're responsible for anything that's investments related, and a lot of it is research oriented and things like
Mhm.
that. And there's different firms that can be certainly a more internal role, but because of who we are at Ellevest and we really want to engage more women, it's a little of a combination. There are certain roles at other firms where there is a person, sometimes they're called like the chief investment strategist, whose only role is to be outward facing. And so they'll take, research that's done inside the firm and be kind of the voice for that. Obviously, those are mainly at the big firms, we're pretty
Yeah.
small. And so all of us play, wear different hats
Sure.
and play different roles. But yeah, so a lot of it's on I like obviously the research and the analytical work, but I've
Yeah.
started to learn to love, how do I share that out, with
Right.
a bigger audience.
Right. And you actually recently published some new research about women and finance and investing. And I'm including the links in the show notes because I think everyone needs to read this. It's so well done. It was visually like very easy to understand. I mean, data visualization, thank goodness for that. For people like me who are no, I'm not the one that wants to pour over the material. So the data visualization is such a powerful way to show and tell the story of the data. But for everyone listening, I mean, this research that you all have put out, it came out in September, I believe, or early October, is just out of this world. It's so important for everyone to read.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, we're very excited about it. So what you're talking about is the Ellevest Women's Financial Health Index or
Yes.
Financial Wellness Index. And so this was really created. This is actually kind of the incredible work of one of my colleagues, Dr. Kate Sullivan, who is our chief data scientist at Ellevest. And basically our goal was to try to measure, as holistically as possible, something that kind of gives us an idea of how well women are doing from a financial perspective, right? Because we have, there's our health, mental wellness and physical wellness. And we really want to think about sort of financial wellness and what are all the components that go into that. And so, some of it is obviously limited by what data we can find, but really we went back to kind of measure, okay, how were women doing before the pandemic and what happened during the pandemic and how well have they recovered? And now with inflation, how are they doing? So you're right, the visual is I was like, wow, okay, this is not so good for women right now, but it's really, it's something that we obviously intend to continue to publish over time. And it is also something that I think helps to inform how we want to invest and how do we invest to kind of help more women and to close some of the gaps that we're seeing and help women along their financial journey.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that really stood out for me in the positive sense is that financial wellness or health was higher up in the priority stack
Yes.
than ever before. And I think for obvious reasons, the pandemic plus inflation, it's very not just top of mind, but it's so evident in our everyday. I mean, you can't not notice what's going on, and so it becomes a concern. And hopefully, that becomes a positive catalyst for creating lasting change through habits and strategies, instead of it being, we could focus on the step back a little bit financially that women have had to take, so many of them leaving the workforce. I mean, there's a lot of things that haven't been fantastic, but I think that we can really focus on those where we can make positive change going forward. So I appreciated that one. That one was the thing that stood out for me the most. I thought, great, they're thinking about it more. There's so much good work that can be done here. That, there's a willing audience that wants to learn and really take that, for me, the elevation of their own finances and their own wealth into their own hands.
100%. You spot on. That was definitely very encouraging to see that women are prioritizing their financial wellness. In that same survey, it was really interesting. So it kind of confirmed that the gender investing gap still exists. We found that 36% of women are currently investing versus 63% of men.
Wow.
So, obviously at Ellevest, we're really trying to close that gap. But interestingly enough, if you ask about who's worried about market volatility, only 38% of women are worried about market volatility versus 58% of men. So I feel like women need to be investing, but once they are investing, they're really focused on kind of the long term. They're really focused on the what I would consider sort of the right things when it comes to investing.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, the like, not set it and forget it, but don't
Right.
worry about something that unless you really need it tomorrow, then it really isn't, it doesn't help us, any of us, to be looking at the stock markets, to be looking at the portfolio. I mean, unless you're sitting down and you're doing your quarterly or annual, maybe quarterly, not these days, like rebalancing or what have you. But other than that, it really shouldn't be the thing that causes us distress. But unfortunately, in almost all the conversations I've been having, men and women alike, because there's so much media exposure around the fear, and we see the word plunging all the time.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, is plunging again? And and it's like, how am I supposed to breathe if everything's plunging all the time? And so, it's just like, let's not pay attention to that and just know that we set a good plan in place. We took the time to do it, and then we put it in place, and then we will check back on it later, because chances are it'll be just fine when the market exits the bear market. And we can, and we just don't need to pay attention to that on top of the so many other things that we could do with more immediacy, maybe in our budget. I don't know, in our everyday lives, like finding ways to cancel subscriptions that we were like, oh, whatever, I'll deal with it later. But, an extra 20, 30, $50 a month is helpful these days. And so it's like, what can I do in the immediate term that helps me feel a sense of control when maybe out there I feel like I have no control, and I don't have any control.
Yeah, I could not have said it any better. Spot on.
Yeah. I mean, these are such important conversations for everybody to hear, because we're all in the same boat about how we feel. And so knowing that, like, not worrying about it is also not just better for our financial health, but our emotional health and our physical health at the end of the day, and mental health. Just like stay away from it and just focus on other things. So I'm glad to hear that women have more of that mentality for like the longer term. And we can talk about this a little bit later in our conversation. But it's also one of the things for me when I think about real estate, and when you just can't sell your real estate because you're having a bad day, and you check your portfolio, and it's like, I always say it saves us from ourselves, in terms of, we can't just sell off the building that we invested in. Like, we have to wait for it to come to term, and we can hold it, and it's got the cash flow and everything. So these are some of the things also that for a lot of my investors, obviously would focus on the real estate piece, where it's like, it doesn't allow you to make knee-jerk reactions.
Exactly. And it's I'm so glad you brought that up, because with real estate and with other private investments where there are longer hold times, sometimes 10 years, for example, which, if you're a long-term investor, 10 years is definitely within that range, right? And people often talk about real estate and other private investments as like, oh, the big drawback is that it's illiquid, can't get your money out, right? But I really view at it, I think that liquidity is a benefit. It's a feature. It's not a disadvantage for exactly what you're saying. It is actually prevents us from overreacting, from that knee-jerk reaction. And it kind of keeps us focused on the long term.
Right.
And so 10 years goes by pretty quickly. And in many cases, especially real estate, there's, kind of, it's not like you're just, sitting there and waiting for something to return. Often there's, some distributions along the way.
Right.
But, not being able to sell it right away, I think is really a benefit for long-term investors. Of course, if you need that money, if you think you're going to need that money in 5 years, don't put it into that kind of investment. But if this is for your retirement and a long horizon, I really think, the illiquidity is not a detriment or a
Right.
disadvantage.
Right. That's a great way to say. I love that you said that it's a feature because it really is. Yeah, it really is. Yeah. And do you invest in real estate then? Is it
I
something
do.
yeah,
I
okay.
do. I
Yeah.
do. So, I mean, obviously, besides, residential, I do invest in some funds that invest in multifamily. So, both in the affordable, like kind of rent restricted affordable, and also kind of the workforce. So, housing that is, I would say, sort of affordable for, the local community.
Yeah.
And so what I love about it, not only is there the opportunity to make, financial returns, which is obviously very important, but in these cases, I think real estate is one of those areas where you can really make a direct positive impact on a community on many different levels. And so, it's one of those impact investments that I really look for those reasons.
Oh, I couldn't have said it better than myself. Thank you for saying that. It is a way to make impact. And we also, Alpha, we invest in workforce and affordable with some unique strategies in that space as well. And sometimes it's not just affordable with vouchers like capital A affordable, but these days the affordability discussion is really around affordability for, I mean, people, we shouldn't even be talking about affordability for the nurses and the teachers and the service workers. And like,
Exactly.
it shouldn't be an issue. And yet it is. This is what we're in. So, we can't fight the system, but we can do our best as investors. And I know impact is really important to you. And I would love to hear a little bit more about that. Why is it so meaningful to you personally?
I feel as a investment professional, obviously as a chief investment officer, I really want returns. Returns are super important from a financial perspective, right? I like money just like the next person. Let's put that out there. But to be able to invest to earn both returns and also to help others in a meaningful way is really, I think, the best thing in the world. It just makes me happy, honestly. And I think today it is even more important because we have big social and environmental issues that are very pressing and that are growing. And if you think about it, sort of government has, sort of like this much money, and they can put in regulations and things and create change, which is fantastic. Nonprofits are out there. They probably have even less money. And then, private markets is like this big, right? And so I feel like it's really, private markets is where the opportunity is to really help move the needle, to really, close some of these gaps and address some of the social issues that we're seeing. And then second, we haven't really talked about this yet, but there's like a new wave of investors that are coming. And, I'm talking about sort of the greatest wealth transfer. They call it the greatest wealth transfer in history, right? Where money from the baby boomers is being inherited through younger generations, and women, because we live longer in general than men, we're going to inherit a significant portion of that. And, there's, a lot of growing evidence and research that shows that both women and younger generations are more socially conscious, and they want to invest in investments that not only earn returns, but also have some kind of positive impact. And so there's a lot of demand, I think, that is coming for impact investing. And so I think that there's a huge opportunity right now for the financial industry to really kind of step up and kind of meet the needs of this sort of new wave of clients. Second, I also think, not in all cases, but in many cases, greatest investment opportunities are often found in places where we are underinvested. And so I love, what Alpha is doing in terms of affordable and workforce housing. Because when I think about that, right, that exists because there's a supply and demand imbalance, right? There's not enough supply and there's way more demand for housing, let's just say, as you said, not rent restricted, but there's just affordable for the social worker and the nurses and the firemen in the community, right? There just isn't enough housing that is affordable. And so the returns from this kind of investment aren't driven by what's happening in the market and whether the Fed's going to raise rates. And in some sense, a lot of people think of it as a recession resilient, right? As
Yeah.
long as there is this growing imbalance and this gap, there's going to be the need for this kind of housing, and that's really where the financial return comes from. And so I think that, similarly to housing, there are other gaps, communities, areas that are underserved and under-resourced. And those are the places that are sort of overlooked by investors. And often I think that's actually where there's the potential for really strong investment returns alongside kind of closing the gap. So in my mind, that is a huge, huge double bottom line and something that I think is really going to move the needle in a lot of the issues that we're seeing today.
Oh, I agree. I'm curious, what would some of those be? Is that because for me, I also invest in founders. So I like to do a bit of venture as part of my portfolio. And that really, all that venture is going into women and underrepresented founders, not just women, but like I think there's a huge opportunity there. It's proven to have like stronger returns. I'm curious what you're seeing from that perspective of these opportunities that not enough people are looking at yet.
Yeah, so that's another great example, right? We all know those, statistics where was it 2 or 4% of venture capital money is going to women.
Mhm.
So, and there's a lot of women entrepreneurs, and I think that is also another area where women are underfunded, and so in some sense, it represented an investment opportunity. So a couple other areas are so one of the venture funds that we have on our platform is actually focused on innovation in the construction industry. And so super interesting because, global construction industry is a very, very large industry and growing very quickly, but at the same time, it's one of the least digitized industries.
Mhm.
And so they've been doing, things the way they've been doing it for, decades. And so in some ways, in many ways, actually, it's very ripe for disruption through technology. And there's some really interesting companies that are doing some very innovative things like, 3D printing of housing, for example, and things like that, right?
Yeah.
And so when I look at that, like, hey, here's an industry that is ripe for disruption. There's a lot of opportunity to make a huge, a lot of progress in terms of cutting the time and the cost to construction. Just from a financial perspective, I think there's a huge commercial opportunity there.
Mhm.
And at the same time, really the goal of this particular fund is really to help relieve global housing poverty and to address homelessness. So obviously, if we can build housing cheaper, faster, and at higher quality, that really helps, one of, basically global homelessness. So that's another example of where I think you've got a great opportunity for financial return and also to help close the housing gap.
Oh, amazing. Well, my husband works in commercial construction and he works in computational design. He runs a comp
Oh,
design team. So he's doing all kinds of crazy things and using even I think it's VR technology. Like so there's like little bits and pieces there. And if they don't step up and innovate, especially on like really complex projects, they do get left behind because, doing things the same way they've always been done, while that does work for a while, then there's consolidation, especially in times like these where, a company's balance sheet and how well they've done with their sales, et cetera. So I wasn't expecting you to say construction technology. I think, and I also think from having come from fintech myself that, that went into prop tech. So there was a lot around prop tech, but that was more like property management technology, all great things. But the construction technology is not talked about enough at all. So that's a fund that you have inside of Ellevest, or is it an Ellevest fund? How do the funds work for Ellevest?
yeah. So we are not a fund manager, so we don't offer any of our own kind of
Okay.
products or funds. So what we do is we look for fund managers. So like an alpha, for example,
Mhm.
or in this case, it is a fund manager. And then what we do is we vet them, from an investment perspective, operational, all of those things. And then once we've kind of approved them, they go on our platform and we invest on behalf of clients, for which the investment is appropriate.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, and so you obviously also will have impact funds
Yes.
on Ellevest as well.
Yeah. So I would say the vast majority of our private investments are impact in
Wow.
some way. Yeah, because that's really what we're seeing clients most engaged about and most excited about.
Oh, that's really exciting. I'm so happy to hear that because it's the consumer in a way, the client that really drives things. And we often don't know how powerful we are in driving what we want by asking for it and forcing it in a way. And so I'm really happy to hear that and that you are responding to those demands with a yes, absolutely, instead of, oh wait, but the traditional way that you're supposed to do funds is over here and these index funds over here and over there. And then, like we were talking about before we recorded, there's a bit of dismissiveness often in the advisory world where it's like, oh yeah, well, I don't have that product, it'll take however long to get it through the channel and et cetera, et cetera. So why don't you just go in this like easy peasy S&P index for a minute, and then you get busy with your life and you forget about it, and then you're like, wait a second, I thought that I could do more. So that's just a really long way of saying that that's amazing that you are responding to the demand, and that response gives more power to the change, which is why I always say that we need to move money into the right hands to change the world.
Yes. That's so, so, so true. You're just spot on about that. And I really do think that this great wealth transfer will accelerate that. And so it's interesting that you talk about sort of the dismissiveness of, not all,
Not
obviously
all.
not all
Yeah.
financial advisors, but I think the data shows I read somewhere in both cases for both women and the millennial generation, like it's something like 85%, maybe even more of them leave their financial advisor once they've inherited the wealth, either from their parents or from their spouse, and they find a new one. And I think a lot of it is because they feel like their needs aren't getting met by their current advisor. And we do see that a lot from Ellevest when clients come here and like, I've been talking about impact with my advisor for years and they just haven't done anything about it and I'm tired. And so, we take the opposite approach. Like I want to hear like, what are you excited about? And if there is a way for us to find a fund manager that can offer both those competitive returns and we will go there. And so a great example was a client who's super interested in regenerative agriculture and regenerative farming, and I'd not even had heard the words, but I didn't really know what it was. And she told me to watch this Netflix documentary, and I watched it and I was like, wow, totally opened my eyes to the impact on climate change. I'm like, oh, this is really exciting. And so I went to work and like, who's doing work in this area? And there, as it turns out, there are managers that are actually doing work to transition farms from traditional farming to regenerative farming. And so, we're starting to do some of the due diligence on some of the fund managers. So
Oh,
it
that's
is, you're right. It's like,
exciting.
yeah, it's super exciting. It's really a fun, super fun part of my job,
Oh
I would
my
say.
gosh, see, that would be fun for me. But yeah, like that's really exciting. And I know also, just to keep on this topic for just a moment, the circular economy is also something that has really piqued my interest too, with this like the around everything, and how big of an opportunity there is to, instead of having to rely on primary materials that are extractive in nature and obviously more and more expensive with everything that's been going on, and moving them around, is like this idea of like how much we can reuse, recycle, and create a regenerative system and still make plenty of profit, but change our relationship to consumption and to the planet. And it still is in this box of, like you're saying, like returns for everyone.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And yeah, I mean, the more that we can integrate that in some way, I think the better. And it's amazing. I think there are some such brilliant and smart people out there that are doing like really interesting work in this. How do we, how to repurpose waste and things that we would normally throw away and create something. And it's interesting. One of the real estate fund managers that is on our platform, like so one of they buy, so they don't develop, but they acquire multifamily and then they renovate, and it's sometimes heavy, but most of the time it's kind of moderate, that
Yeah.
one of their goals is to reuse materials
Oh,
and to have a very sustainable plan for. And so instead of like ripping everything out and like, throwing it away, like, what can we reuse and how do we,
yeah.
make the properties more energy efficient and, lower water landscaping and
Mhm.
things like that. So,
Mhm.
I love, sort of strategies that sort of have multiple levels of impact.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, I love the, the whole circular economy is something that, love to, integrate into all strategies if there's a way to
Yeah.
do
Yeah.
that.
I'm pretty sure it's coming, like you said. I mean, demographically, and also not demographically just by age, but demographically in terms of, I guess, like our desires, because from that perspective, I'm similar to a millennial or a Gen Z more so than I am to Gen X. So sometimes it's, it's easy statistically to say, well, if you're like 40 something, then you're in this category and like you're this or you're that. But really in our behavior, in our values, I feel like it's like demographic values, and those transcend age. And
Yes.
and I hope that that is something that gets talked about a lot more, because even maybe a person that is a little older that might not understand, because in their generationally, they didn't have the same ability to make an impact.
Right.
And it's not new to younger people. It's new to everyone. There's a responsiveness driven by the people who are in a position to listen, actually listen, like you, and do something about it instead of just going the well-worn path. And I think that's really important for everyone that's listening to know, that it's like this, we have so much power to
Yes.
ask for and get what we want, especially if it aligns with our values. It's just so important.
Yes, 100%. And I agree. I think, especially in the financial industry, we don't ask. We,
Mhm.
we need to demand
Yeah.
more. I think, the industry is used to pushing product, right?
Mhm.
Or sometimes they listen and then it's, regardless of what you say, it's this is the right thing for you, right? I see that a lot.
Yeah.
Um, and I think, we need to retrain ourselves and say, that's not good enough. Not being satisfied with less than what
Mhm.
we're looking for.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so I do think that is slowly kind of starting to change.
Yeah.
And I know I'm being very skeptical by saying this, but I think it's changing because they see the commercial opportunity
Sure.
in sort of, like, and that's fine. I'm perfectly fine with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
That if your motivations are that, as long as you are creating, solutions and investing products that, meet those needs, and
Yeah. Yeah.
fantastic.
Yeah, it's like working with and within the system to change it for the better
Yes.
instead of fighting against it. And like, that saying in like personal development, or even in like spirituality, where you say what you resist persists. So like the more we fight against something, the stronger it kind of gets against us. So even in this, it's really like, here's the system, we're in it. And I have these conversations with women all the time around like, it's important to understand how it works so that you can feel empowered to do the
Yes.
things that you can do, right? Get back to that control. Where can we have control? We love control. And so where can we have some modicum of control, and then to make the change? And then over time, and we're having this conversation today where you're telling me that things are changing because people are demanding that change, which too often women do not do. We're not so good at demanding change. And I hope that does change.
Yes, I totally agree. And I also think part of it is educational. And I just mean because this kind of investing is new.
Mhm.
A lot of people like don't even realize that this is a way that they can invest. And so we often hear that a lot when we're saying, hey, we think this would be the right thing for your portfolio from an investments
Right.
perspective. And and by the way, it also has this, and then they're like, wow, I didn't realize I could invest this way. And it's sort of like a real eye opener. And then they're on the edge of their seat. And that's
Mhm.
the best part, because usually, like, if you're flipping through pie charts and what have you, like, people are like, eyes glaze over. But
Yeah.
once you start talking about sort of the impact, they're like, oh, suddenly awake.
Yes. Yes. They're
So I
like,
think
oh, those
part
are
of
my
it is,
values. You're talking about my values. Yeah. Now I'm going to stand up and listen, and I'll put money towards that. And a lot of that is changing. Would you say that women are more ready today than they were before? Like, given your long history in financial services. Like, have you noticed a change just in general for women, despite what, the financial wellness survey did say there was a step back, but there's an awareness of it too, which I think is important to say. Are they more ready, or is it because it's kind of chicken and egg? Are women more ready and then you have services and communities pop up? Or is it because services and communities popped up and women started to gravitate toward them?
That's a great question. And I think it's a little bit of both. I think women are a little more ready today. I think there's definitely more work, to help women become more ready, and also more work to create services and to help accelerate investing for women. I think what may be driving it is, I would say we definitely see more like products and services and companies that are kind of by women and for women, designed to serve women, whether that's healthcare or clothing, or even organizations like Chief that are really kind of focused on women, right? And so I think there's more growing awareness for women that, hey, we don't have to settle
Mm,
for services and products that weren't designed for us.
mm,
We should, demand. And I think there's also more women who are thinking, hey, that makes sense. I'm going to create something that is just for women. And I think this kind of awareness drives women to seek out more, female centric firm. And so I think the more demand that there is, the more solutions there will be. So I think there's a bit of a trend.
mm,
I think we need kind of both. We need to help women, feel ready. And then we also want to make sure the solutions are there when they are ready.
mm, Yeah, well said. And I see that. And in my organization, wow, Women of Wealth, we've really noticed, and it's really being built as a community, how important is, like, and I'm seeing it, how important is community in
Yeah.
this elevation, empowerment, action taking movement. I feel it's a movement. So how important is community in this movement?
It's very, it's there's kind of like two sides to that question. I think it's very important in the sense that women, because money can be lonely in many
Wow.
ways. And I think, women, we were brought up not really to talk about money. There's sometimes an embarrassment or a shame about money, whether you have too little or too much. And women, versus men, like when I think about my husband, like, one of the first things, when I met him is he's talking about how much he makes and how much, his friend makes. And I was like, whoa, like, why are you telling me this? It's like a little competitiveness right there. And, I've never talked to my girlfriends about that because it just
Hmm.
wasn't nice to do so. But I think that kind of stigmatizes it, right? And puts us at a disadvantage. And so I think that now I lost my train of thought.
No, no, no. Everything you're saying is so important about, like, the embarrassment. You said money was lonely. That was so profound to me, and you explained why, because there is shame in talking about, you don't want to be judged. I've experienced that. I'm probably still working on that a little bit in myself around, well, I don't want them to judge me or think that, oh, why does she want more? She makes plenty. Like, constantly in my head. So money being lonely is actually really important. So that's what you were saying is very profound.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. It's kind of like, oh, how much more do you need? Are you greedy? Or being afraid, I was like, oh, you're how old, and you only make that much, or you've only there's it doesn't you just like a lose-lose situation, right? And so I think when I still think that women probably don't feel that comfortable talking about their own personal situation and revealing that, especially among strangers. Well, maybe it's more comfortable around strangers versus friends.
Mm.
But I do think where women do value community is feeling like, oh, she has, I'm in a situation that's very similar to hers. And therefore, I don't feel alone in my situation. And
Mhm.
so when I hear even you, Adapita telling me like, oh, sometimes I feel embarrassed, or I'm like, oh my gosh, if she feels that way, then I don't feel like, okay, then I'm normal, right? Whatever that means. But I think it's more like, when you hear about other women's experiences, it kind of mitigates that feeling of loneliness. And I think that's where the community can be really powerful.
Oh my gosh. I'm going to listen to this over and over again because it's so important. Thank you for diving into that with me, because that is such a huge takeaway with the loneliness piece. And I don't think I've ever even really thought of it that way. And yet I'm building a community for women, but I didn't understand I understood my own shame, but I didn't associate that with loneliness. And, women are such of community. I mean, we love to be together, and we tend to, we're more nurturing, all those things that they say on in aggregate. And so this makes a lot of sense about why we do want to be in community. And it's important to break those barriers and kind of break that seal and be the one to say it and normalize the conversations. Because if we don't normalize the conversations, and that shame and embarrassment and fear of judgment holds us back from going to speak to a financial professional and demanding better returns or demanding investments aligned with our values. We won't even do that if we aren't willing to say that we want more. And it doesn't matter why, because we do. And I think that should be enough.
100%. 100%. And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I remember I met a woman the other day, who, by all measures would be classified as someone who's wealthy and has a financial advisor who she really likes. And she was kind of talking about, she really wants to do impact investing, but her advisor is very open to that, but doesn't quite know how to go about it. And so she was saying, hey, I identified some interesting investments that were aligned with my values, and I brought them to the financial advisor, and she's helping me through that. And I just kind of, this light bulb went out. I'm like, that's great. Really happy to hear that. But I'm like, that financial advisor should be doing it for you. Like that, it's sort of like, it's kind of like, we're happy having, getting this much, as this woman is like, oh, I just feel lucky to be in the room kind of thing. Like, I just feel lucky. And I was thinking, no, wait a minute. Like, no, you should find a financial advisor who's going to do this for you and not just help you.
Yes.
And I think that sort of gap is almost like, as you said, like we're not kind of demanding, demanding is like, probably has some negative connotation, but like, I think I can't think of a better word. Requesting, quite sure, but I think you're right. It's really about, hey, understanding like what is, what should I be getting? What is the value that I should be getting, and demanding that you get that value.
Yeah. It's like an expectation, like that shouldn't even have to be a demand. I get what you're saying. It's like, it shouldn't even have to be a demand. It should be just an inherent expectation. That's how it should be. And hopefully in my lifetime, in our lifetimes, like that becomes part of the conversation for everyone, especially for women, because we are very much behind the investment curve, right? I don't know if the statistic off the top of your head about the percentage of, there's some statistics that show how much further ahead men are just by virtue of investing over time. It's millions and millions of dollars.
It is. And that really sets women back.
Yeah. And so we're here to change it.
That's right.
Yeah. So oh my gosh, I could talk to you forever about this, but I have one last question before I let you go. And that question is, what does wealth mean to you?
What does wealth mean to me? So when I think about wealth, obviously traditionally it's all about money. That's what it feels like. It's all about money. When we talk about wealthy people, we generally mean people who have a ton of money or people who have a lot of possessions. I guess that's the way I think about it. But, to me, I think wealth has a lot of different dimensions. And so wealth can certainly mean money and assets, but it can also refer to family and friends and having a rich community. So ultimately, I would say I equate wealth to happiness. And so if I see a person, who is surrounded by the love of family and friends and has, a lot of meaningful relationships, I think of that person as wealthy. Certainly somebody could have $1 billion and be very unhappy. And in my mind, that person is poor. So I think, we each define, what makes us happy. and therefore, I think what makes us wealthy.
I love that. Yeah. It's a common theme, like especially with those of us who are in the financial services industry to any degree. We say, well, the rational answer is, a certain like wealth as in like accumulating assets, dollars in the bank. I had one person one time, they said it's literally the amount of dollars in my bank account, which is true. But then there's the much bigger component, which you spoke to. And I love that you brought it also back to community, because it really ties into everything you're doing at Ellevest, and it's something that's very near and dear to my heart. So thank you so much again for joining me today. This has been such a phenomenal conversation, and congratulations to you and to Ellevest and all the phenomenal work that you are doing out in the world for everybody.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me, Inde. This hour just flew by.
It did. Thank you. Thanks for tuning in to Real Wealth, Real Health. We hope that you've enjoyed today's episode and found it both informative and insightful. We welcome all your questions and your feedback about today's episode, and especially we welcome your questions about specific topics that you would like us to cover. So shoot us an email at podcast@alphai.com. And if you have a moment, we really appreciate ratings and reviews, as it helps us grow our online community and our interactions with you. And we'll also be linking to a number of relevant articles on topics that we might have touched on during our conversations. Some of them are broad, some of them are technical, but we're always aiming to provide information that helps you better understand the mechanics of building this healthy financial foundation, especially if you're looking to do this with real estate.